welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Let's call this part 24, Mussolini, an Italian-American experience. All right, guys, I'm going to do something different tonight. I'm going to try and take you back as best as I can to 1943 in Sicily. And I'm going to tell you, well, basically where my family came from and what they suffered through during the invasion of Sicily in 1943 by the Allies, led by the American, the British, and the Canadian troops. And not a lot of military details I can give you, but at least what the environment was like for most Sicilians at the time. In fact, let me do a share screen here. Let me pull this up, guys, right? Give you a better idea where my family was from. And we'll go here. We'll go to Google Maps, and you see here this island of Sicily. And my family was from the what is this? It's up here on the left side here, the west side of Sicily. My father is from this city called Marsala. If you guys recognize that name, it was the port of entry for Garibaldi, who came in with his 1,000 red shirts and eventually took over all of Sicily, eventually all of Italy surrounding the Vatican, and eventually installing a monarchy in Italy. And that's where he landed, was Marsala, Sicily. From, I believe, Sardinia, he came in. There you have an archway, sort of a memorial dedicated to him called La Porta di Garibaldi, with the door of Garibaldi's where he entered, where the unification of Italy started. Now, there's controversy behind the unification of Italy, right? The Vatican wasn't too crazy about it at the time, especially Pope Pius IX, who viciously condemned it. From my understanding, there was Freemasonic elements in the Garibaldi movement, and in general, you had several revolutionary attempts even before Garibaldi. You had another guy by the name of Manzini that was trying to create this revolution about, I think, 20 years earlier, right around there. And he failed at the time. But all these movements were leftist movements. A lot of them, from my understanding, were inspired by again, the French revolutions and everything that was going on in Europe, as really the entire 19th century, all of the 1800s was a time of revolutions in Europe, and really the byproduct of the French Revolution and everything that spread out from there. And so that's where my father is from. But if you look closely here, see where my cursor is, the island of Favignana. That's where my mother was born. And this is a part of, or should I say, these are considered, these three islands here, the Agadi Islands, right? You got Levenzo and you got Marettimo, and of course Favignana, where my mom was from, the Agadi Islands. Beautiful, picturesque islands. That's where my grandfather he was a fisherman, and that's where they lived. And so, being so close, I think Marsala to Favignana, conventional boat ride is about 40-45 minutes, right around there. Now they got the faster kind of hydroplane boats that get there like in 20-25 minutes. And so whatever arrangement was made at the time between my mother and my father, obviously they met and they got married. And the rest is history, and I'm here because of that. But it's interesting because when we go back to 1943, well, first, my father was born in 35. So when the invasion of Sicily starts, he's about 7-8 years old. My mother was born after the war in 1946. The war ends in 45. She's born in 46. So because my father was the youngest of 7 siblings, my mother being 10 years younger, in many ways, my father's generation and my mother's generation are two different generations, right? And so everybody on my father's side was born before the war, during the reign of Benito Mussolini. My father had, 5 brothers, 2 sisters, or 4 brothers, 2 sisters. And then my mother, after the war, was, I think, 3 sisters and 4 brothers, right? 8. Okay, I guess. Yeah, that's right. 8. No, yeah, eight total. Eight, no, seven total. Excuse me, seven total. Um, and so for my mother's end, it's an interpretation that comes from my grandparents, right, who were raising children, raising a family at that time when it broke out. On my father's side, we're getting more the stories of the siblings themselves, including my father, who was 7 years old, 8 years old when it broke out. War ends at 45. He's probably almost 10 years old at that point. He told me that he remembers these images of the destruction, of course, of Italy. Now, how much of it he actually remembered, how much of it was transcribed to him after the war by his siblings, I don't know. But obviously, he did remember. And the one thing he remembered very vividly was the hunger, because there was no food. Sicily had been hit by massive inflation even before the invasion of Sicily started. The north, they were fine, but the south, they were hit with massive inflation, and they were starving. I mean, it was real over there at the time. And so in 1943, after the Allies had beat back the Germans, the Italian in Northern Africa, the next target, of course, was Sicily, where the invasion point to kind of come into the main landing as the third front of World War II. Obviously, we all know about the Normandy invasion. We all know about Operation Barbarossa when the Soviets start coming in from the east. But I think the one that's probably the least talked about is the invasion of Sicily as the gateway to eventually get on the main peninsula and start working your way up, is what the Allies were doing. So cities were being bombed, they were being shelled before the invasion started. There was a few fake landing attempts prior to the one that will come down in more of the southeast, right? Because I think the invasion, let me see here if I get this over here. If you look at the map here, I forgot exactly what city, but it's right around in this area that the actual invasion started. Actually, it was two here and right around here. So they came in from the south, southeast kind of, and up from the north, where both Allied battalions entered there. They shelled the cities first, of course. And I think that's what my father remembers the most, because the Allies did target civilian populations. They were trying to exhaust the general population. The Italians were already queasy in regards to this war from the get-go. And they knew that if they shelled the cities, they may get a coup d'etat of sort with the Italian government at the time. And while that coup never really happened, Italians got angry and mad about the war, about the conditions, the suffering that was going on. In the process, many Italians were killed. Civilians killed, structures, churches, everything went down. This is the art of modern warfare, right? The total war theory. And what happens is when you have a divided world in terms of faith and religion, you don't have, sort of the church in place that can be a moral arbiter of truth between two Catholic kingdoms anymore. This is why the total war theory is a modern phenomenon. And it's fought between peoples that look less kindly on each other, that look at each other as if they have self of a less worth because they're not us. They don't share our religion. They don't share our culture. They don't share any of these things. And the church can't be an arbiter. It can't be a mediator to resolve any of these issues at the end of the day. So this is why in modern liberal societies, we've turned to these extreme forms of war, the total war theory, as Christopher Ferreira noted in his book, Liberty, the God That Failed. And, total annihilation until the point you surrender or you give yourself in. And this is why really the 20th century was the bloodiest century in human history. And it wasn't even close. You can add up all the previous centuries before that, going back for a couple thousand years, and you won't get the body count, the gulags, the concentration camps, the destruction that you see in the 20th century. And part of it had to do, again, as a byproduct, I believe, of the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment, which divided us at every level, first at the religious level, and then culturally, and then, everything else that comes with that. And so there was no mercy. This was going to be, listen, we're going to just bomb everybody into oblivion until you surrender, until you're forced to accept our will at the end of the day. And that was the strategy. That was the plan. And so some of the stories, and well, let me preface it with this. one of the reasons, as I tell you these stories, that I fell in love with history and became a history major was precisely because of the stories my father told me when I was a kid. Now, my father passed away in 97, and there was so much more today that I wish I could ask him now, things that I didn't appreciate in my youth, but I remember some of them. And you know, these stories are, you know, they're vague stories oftentimes, but they're real stories, they're real experiences. These are not the kind of stories you're going to get in your history books. History that in modern times has all been tainted by politics. And you know, to my father, it was real, the starvation, the death, all the things that came with it. And so when you're in a city like Marsala, generally, you know, you're doing your everyday affairs and you know the Allies are approaching, you know, the alarms, the sirens go off, and where would they go? They would go to the countryside. That's where you go to try and escape the bombing runs because the Allies are bombing the cities. My father told me the stories about how when they would flee cities, you know, they nobody had cars, automobiles in those days. If they did, it was only exclusive for the wealthy. Everybody had their you know their donkeys or their horses or they're running on foot is what they're doing. And what my father remembered most vividly was not only the destruction of the city itself, but the dead bodies as you're being shelled by, you know, by bombs and cannon fodder or fire, whatever you want to call it. I'm not a military guy. The bodies just laid on the floor, and there wasn't even time to, you know, clean up the bodies until afterwards, until the shelling had stopped, obviously. And as you flee into the countryside, my father used to tell me it was destruction, but what he remembered the most was the dead bodies on the ground as you're fleeing the city, particularly remembering bodies that were so torn apart by the impact they would sever limbs and even heads. He remembers particularly walking as a kid, seeing a head on the floor. He told me no body around it. Nobody knew. It probably the impact of some kind of a mass mortar, you know, that hit somewhere at some point, um, you know, destroying the body. And you flee to the country to seek safety. And so, you know, and then of course came the stories of starvation um, during the war, particularly with my father's family. It was especially difficult because the patriarchs, my grandmother and grandfather, died and then left 7 siblings to fend for themselves at that time. My father's story is pretty remarkable. Uh, my father was born in November of 1935. 6 months later, his mother died, and 6 months after that, his father died. Cause of death, they're not sure. Um, from what I understand, they used to call it something like water in the belly. I don't know what that is. Some people speculate maybe it was cancer or whatever it was, but who knows? Because again, when you're in the midst of starvation, war, you know, 36, I guess the war hasn't fully kicked off yet for Italy. So maybe it's something else, maybe just a lack of medical resources and disease that were going around. My father was a 1 year old left to the care of his siblings, primarily one of my aunts who was, I believe, 13 years old. The problem, of course, you had is when you're 1 year old, you need breast milk in order to survive. There is no, you know, in those days, there was no formula you could walk down to you know, Walmart or something like that and get your baby formula. You had to survive. Infants had to survive with breast milk from their mothers. And of course, my father didn't have a mother anymore. And so temporarily, well, I say temporarily, the siblings couldn't take care of him, right? My father's siblings probably ran somewhere between, I don't know, 13 and, you know, 5 years old. There was, again, 6 of them before my dad being the youngest at one when my grandparents died. And they could all stay together, take care of each other. But the problem, of course, was my father, who was needing of breast milk in order to survive. And so they gave him away to a family in the community where there was a woman who just had children of her own, and she had the ability, she was lactating, if that's the right term there. and they gave my brother away. And I'm sure for temporary purposes, it gave time for these siblings to figure out what are we going to do, how are we going to pick ourselves up, how we're going to survive. And it also gave my aunt, who would eventually take care of him, a chance to grow up a little bit from 13. And then she got to, I think, age 16, 17, right around there, and she got married. And it gave a chance for my aunt to mature a little bit more for later on to be able to take care of my father. It's a hard story to tell. But in the desperation of the moments, extreme poverty, that's what Sicily was in 1935, 36, they gave my dad away to a family, like I said. And I think a couple years, few years went by, 2, 3, 4 years, something to that effect. And, Italians, Sicilians, close-knit communities, everybody talks, everybody kind of has the same values. And apparently word got back to my father's brothers and sisters that my father was being abused by this particular family. And, I don't think when they gave him away, it was understood that it was a temporary thing. It was more of a permanent thing that he was supposed to be given away. And that's when my dad's brothers and sisters got concerned, and they devised a plan to get him back. And apparently it happened in the middle of the night. And two of my dad's older brothers basically kidnapped him back in the middle of the night and took him home. At that point, my aunt, my oldest aunt, could take care of him. She's now 16, 17. She married a man who had a house already and took all the siblings in with him. And they kidnapped them back. Wow. I mean, that's just pretty amazing. And again, it shows you the breakdown of society. There's no civil services later on because now we're in the war years, right? We're in the war years. We were talking 37, 38, 39, right around there. And things are happening already. And the government is shifting more and more resources to, again, to the war. This is why my father, and I've said this before, I don't know if I've said it on this cast before, my father had no education, none, zero. There was no education system in place for poor peasant Sicilians at the time. And that's why it's amazing. His story is amazing because then he came to America, and despite not being able to read and write, he became a successful businessman. He was in construction. He was a bricklayer. He was a master of his trade. And the years of the war were a struggle, just trying to find a way to survive, find food. And the stories, as we've heard, I went back to Boston about 3 years ago where I was talking to my family, because when we immigrated, my mom's side of the family went out to Los Angeles. My father's side of the family went out to Boston. And I went to Boston to go visit my cousins. And they were telling me stories how, yeah, the times of suffering, starvation was so bad that my uncles, again, and my father, probably at that point, being a little bit older, would actually wait for the German soldiers who were feeding themselves, peeling their potatoes, and cast off the peels in the trash, and they would go collect the peels from the trash. And that's what they would bring home. That's what they would eat, the peels of the potatoes. I mean, that's how dire the situation was. That's why later in life, my father we used to laugh, we used to call him a garbage disposal. He never threw out leftovers. He never did. He saw food as just a very limited resource, even though he's very successful, made a good life for himself in America. And that's why, despite my complaints about liberal society in America in many ways, we always appreciated America. My father always did. He was very grateful for it. And, we put our heads down, we work hard, we were always good citizens in America, appreciated it. What they never expected was how the culture, liberalism would corrupt everything. Nobody saw that coming. Nobody was prepared for the liberal nature, especially the culture that would consume their offspring once they got here. No, that's why, With America, it's been difficult because on one hand, you're thankful for all the prosperity, without a doubt. There's been many blessings and gifts that those immigrants have gotten here. But at the same time, it's like I said, in a liberal society, it's a double-edged sword. In many ways, you get the material gifts, but you sell your soul, you sell your faith, you sell your family, you sell it all out because we've lost all of that. So pick your poison, right? Pick your poison. So yeah, they would actually collect the peels cast off by the German soldiers. Because at that time, remember, Italy was struggling in the war, and Hitler had to send out a few panzer divisions to defend the island. And the German soldiers were stationed all over Sicily. And as again the invasion happens and the Allied troops start landing, the Germans cross back behind Catania. Is it? Let's see here. Let's look at the map here, guys. Right. Messina, sorry, Messina. See, you can see right here, Messina. This is probably where the Germans probably got off and went back to the mainland here into the Regio del Calabria. Yeah, the province of Calabria. Yeah, that's it right there. So, and so, that's kind of in a nutshell, story on my father's side. All of them born in the time of Mussolini and during the time of war. Now, for my grandparents, my mother's side, a little bit different. All of them were born, not all of them, most of them were born after the war. My mom was born in 46, a year after the war. So I have an uncle who was born in 43. And then my other aunt, my godmother, was born, I think, a year or two earlier, probably 40, 41. I'm thinking, I don't know the exact year. It was a little different because I don't know if they ever faced the same kind of starvation as my dad's family. First of all, you had the parents that were alive, right? My grandmother and grandfather. That's number one. Number two, my grandfather was a fisherman. And so, at the very least, he brought fish home for them to eat. He had his little boat and he'd go out, catch his fish, bring it back, set up his market, sell a few fish to the locals there, then go home. What was left over, he could bring home. So I'm sure there was always a source of food there. I don't know how much, I don't know how diverse that diet was at the time, but I never got the stories of starvation from my mother's side quite as much. It was hard, don't get me wrong. What I remember about my mother's side is the stories of my grandmother, right? It was a time where the Allies were just bombing everything. They would bomb, like I said, the cities and the piazzas and things of that nature, targeting civilian sites. And, when the airplanes were coming, the bombers were coming, you just pick up and run for the caves. Because, see, in the mainland of Sicily, you run to the country. But in a small island like this, there's not a whole lot of places to run to, really. And so what they had in Favignano was they had these caves inside kind of the mountain or along the coast areas where the beach are. There's a beach here called Cala Rosa. Now, I haven't been to Sicily since 1986. My brother's gone a few times. It's beautiful. I'd love to go back, but I have a disability that kind of prevents me from going, makes it difficult. But see, Cala Rosa here is a beautiful, picturesque beach. It's unbelievable. It's like a swimming pool. But along here, this area here is a bunch of caves that you can still see when you click on pictures of like 4K walkthroughs on YouTube of Favignana. Now, be careful because it's Europe and it's all been liberalized now. But, whenever you watch beach territory in Europe now, Italy as well, you got the girls that are all walking around with the flossie string up their butt, right? I mean, this is the moral depravity that's hit all of the West now. And so, I don't want anybody to look this up and cast some sin there. So, but this was the sort of the main town, the piazza where the church was. And I actually did a podcast on my mother's church of Favignana a while back. It's part of the archives here, frankly speaking. But the story was, it was crazy. The alarms would go off and here come the bombing raids. And, you just grab a child, if you got a small infant like my grandmother had, you got him, you stuck him under your arm and you're running for the caves is what you're doing. And in one case, the story my mom told me, was that apparently we had a relative at the time who was so freaked out, so scared of when the bombers were approaching, she ran for the caves and forgot her own infant. And my grandmother had to run into the house to grab her infant. And so she's running with two children, one under one arm, one under the other arm. And, my grandmother is saving a child, as they're running to the caves to get away from the bombing runs. You know, they had to live through that. And of course, then they had to live through the occupation and all that that happened with the uh, Allied forces. Now, like I said earlier, this area of Sicily, the the west east, right? The west east. No, it would be the southwest or of the island wasn't a primary invasion point, but it was bombed into an oblivion. I don't know how much Favignana actually had in terms of defenses. I know in Marsala here, they had some, anti-aircraft fires. Still there. I think you can still see them. They left them as sort of a memorial museum type thing there where you would have these big, cannon things where anti-aircraft fires, to fight off against the bombing runs or maybe even also the naval ship bombardment units, things of that nature. But it was a hard time. It was difficult. It was unreal. I can't imagine what it must have been like to live through anything like that. And it's why I'm always in awe of my family and whether it's my grandparents or my father himself that went through such an ordeal to survive that and to come to America and to give us all, you know, a material better way of life. I just I think with my father it's more cut and dry. With my mother, I'm not sure because my grandfather, from what I understand, did okay. He made a good living as a fisherman. They have in Favignana, it's gone now because the Chinese apparently have gone into the Mediterranean and started taking all the tuna. But my grandfather used to be part of an ancient tuna run every year where they used to go collect the tunas. They set up like the different traps. They knew the the swimming patterns, right? Migration patterns of the tuna. Oh no, last I heard is I guess the tuna don't make it down anymore because the Spanish have figured out the route now as well too, and they've blocked the tuna from coming all the way down into the Mediterranean, into Sicily, right by the island of Favignana. So I talked to a cousin a while back, told me that, and so it killed off the tuna industry in Favignana back in. I think the last one was early 2000, maybe 2003. If you type in that tonada, right, the tuna run in Favignana, Sicily, you see some old images of men back like from the 40s, 50s, 30s, right around there. And they got all these big, massive. I mean, they're big tunas in the Mediterranean. They're not these, 30, 40 pound tunas. These are 400 pound, 500 pound tunas. And they would trap them in the net, right? And they'd all be stuck because what would they would do? They set up the chambers of that the fish would swim through, and there's different chambers, and finally you get to the last chamber, which is called the chamber of death, and all the tuna would get stuck in the chamber of death, and then all they had to do is slowly pull up the nets, that chamber on all sides, and the tuna were stuck. There was nowhere to go, and they used pikes at the time to get the fish out of the water as they were stuck in it or flapping around. These things are big, man. They're massive, and it takes 3, 4, 5 guys to haul in one tuna. And you see the blood just all over the water. It was a bloody mess as we're getting these tunas into the boats, but that was life. It was hard work. That was kind of the one time a year where they made a little bit extra money other than the regular fishing they did every year. It was kind of a yearly event that happened. You had a few guys that were like these tradesmen of sorts or these bigwigs that figured out the business aspect of this, uh, that learned how to market it, and then eventually they learned how to put tuna in cans and in olive oil so it could preserve for long periods of time. And it's why we buy now the canned tuna that we do preserved in oil. They figured it out partly on the island of Favignana. The guy that ran it owned the tunada, right? The tuna from the tuna shop, whatever you want to call it in English. They call it the tunada in Sicilian. And many reasons, like I said, that's why we have now the canned tuna that we can all enjoy. They figured out that preserving it in olive oil, it could stay for quite a bit time. It preserves. It tastes excellent. They were experimenting with a lot of different things in order to preserve the fish. So that's kind of my grandfather's story, my grandmother's story that survived. All the siblings survived. And so, these are stories that were given to me as a kid. Lots of them are very generalized, and it always kind of gives us a connection. That's why I think when it comes to World War II with Italians and Sicilians, it's interesting because it's different than, say, when you're coming from a communist country rather than a nation like Italy that under fascism, it was a completely different system. It wasn't a closed society. It didn't shut off a lot of the what do you want to call it? The social elements of freedom. It really was a balance between a certain social structure and lots of different freedoms. It's like I said so many times before, in Italy and Sicily in the 1930s, they didn't rob people of private property rights, right? People own property. They didn't collectivize. They didn't destroy the faith. In fact, Mussolini elevated the church, gave it an equal footing, right? As Raquel Mussolini says in her book, her autobiography of Mussolini, basically what Benito did, he gave Italy a third stool, right? The king, the fascist regime, and then the church. And they didn't persecute the proletariat. In fact, the proletariat, the poor, the peasants weren't even taxed. There was no taxes on them. I told my mom, what was the tax system like when, grandfather was selling fish? She goes, taxes? What taxes? Caught his fish, went back to the land, set up his little table, sold his fish, came home. There was no tax system for the poor in fascist Italy. They kept everything. Tax system was just for the upper classes, the businesses at the time. It was a very simple life. It was very fair in many respects. They looked out for the poor. And then eventually, and this is why I think my existence may be here, is that Mussolini set up programs to encourage women to have children. He paid mothers. And you wonder how much that plays an effect in the size and scope of the families that would eventually be raised at that period in history, especially with my father being the youngest of 7 siblings, right? Was there incentive for my grandparents to have a 7th child, right? Compare that to today in America, right? We're lucky to have 2 now because there's so much disincentive from the distractions of life to the finances, everything of that nature. And of course, we got contraception and abortion that makes it nice and easy for you not to have a big family now, not to even think about family, to devalue family just in general. And the other thing they weren't doing in Italy, and this is what makes it different, they didn't put up big walls so people couldn't escape. That's why so many immigrants left Italy. They could. The communist nations were putting up walls. You try to climb that wall, they shoot you in the back. Not fascist nations. Mussolini's perspective on immigration, I've mentioned this before, I'll say it again, was, listen, I hate to see you go, but if you do leave, wherever you do go, represent us well, work hard, be good citizens. That was his attitude. And Italians left. I mean, this is what happens when, first of all, you lack natural resources, which Italy did. It lacked natural resources. That's why I believe that the main issue why Mussolini joined the side of the Axis was because the British and the French cut him off from natural resources. And the only other place he could really go in that region was Hitler. It's one of the main reasons. Because Mussolini and Hitler did not see eye to eye in a lot of different things. They were different regimes with different values. Everybody wants to put them in the same camp because they were allies, but they really weren't. So, it's one of those things where you got to look at the context of history and be fair to it. And this is what I try and do here on this show, on this cast, in this series. So, but I say it's strange for Sicilians and Italians, because what are they supposed to think about that era, right? About the regime itself? Because whether you like it or not, it's part of our history. And at the same time, it's a time of history, or a regime, a period in Italian history that's looked upon in a negative light. That's why most Italians stayed quiet about it in the States. They didn't know what position to take. And I think also too, liberalization, the propaganda of the evils of fascism, that played into the psyche. But Italians never really, after the war, supported Mussolini. They never defended him. But I'm gonna tell you right now, they never really threw him under the bus either. It was more like, okay, what's the point now? Let's move on. We want to live in peace in America or Argentina or whatever period of history that you're in. But there was really no call to overthrow him up until the war started going bad and people were starving. Up until the war, there was no calls to overthrow Mussolini. He was doing a fine job running the country. It's just that our liberal sentimentalities are offended by it as Americans. And of course, we come to the States and we want to be good Americans. We want to be good citizens. Because that's the thing about Italians, right? And I think you could probably say this for most of the Catholic immigrants, whether they're Irish or whether they're German or Polish. Hard workers. That's all we knew is hard work, survival, right? And most of them were good citizens and they worked hard. Yeah, you had your black sheeps and some crimes, things of that element in the cities at times, trying to survive. I think the challenge coming to a more industrialized nation like America was there was a heavy emphasis on education. A lot of the Sicilians didn't have it. If you could pick up the trades, right, especially fishing or the construction, things of that nature, you were going to be fine in America. There was a great industry for that. And in part, it's why Italians came over, right? Because America needed that industrial base to build up the infrastructure of America. Protestants were already contracepting. The population in America wasn't growing enough. So where do you go to get your population to grow? You go to Catholic countries like you always go to. Catholics to the rescue. That's what it was, because Protestants destroy every society they live in, destroy everything. We know that now. History dictates that. Came over, kept our heads down, and worked hard. And we always appreciate that about America. Still do. I know I have a lot of benefits that a lot of Italians that stay there didn't. At the same time, there does comes that loss of culture, loss of familial connections, right? Loss of ancestral roots, and the loss of the faith. Because Catholicism and liberalism, they don't mix. And while the apostasy is hit everywhere globally, I get that. I think to this day in Sicily, Italy, there's still that historical connection, a historical connection that I think one day will revive in that part of the world. A historical connection that I don't think we have in America. And that's why, in terms of materialism, Italians and other immigrants have done very well. In terms of culture, family, and faith, it's all collapsed. It's all gone at this point, right? Because you pick up the habits of Protestantism within the realm of a Protestant country, that along mixed with Freemasonic values. On one hand, we're thankful for the material gifts because a nation like Italy that was ravaged by revolutions and wars for so many years has trouble establishing a steady economy. On the other hand, in the midst of a liberal society, you sold your soul. And now your kids they're broken socially, culturally, morally. They're divorced, kids out of wedlock, they've lost the faith, they're doing drugs, they're tinkering with LGBT stuff. This is what happens in liberal societies. Now Italy would be hit by that later on because of, again, the liberalization after the war, right? There's a battle for the soul of Italy starting in 1945. It's a battle between capitalists and communists, or America and Soviet Union, for the soul of Italy. And eventually that same liberalization, um, it hits Italy too. And that's why you got the girls walking around with the floss up their butt crack, right? Now in Italy, just like you have it in America. And maybe culturally it took, what do you want to say? A bigger hold, a bigger grasp because of the French Revolution itself. I will say this. I will say this. Difference between the American and the French Revolution. The French Revolution went straight into moral depravity, straight, complete moral depravity that is spread throughout all of Europe. And this is why Europe is much more liberal than America for a long time, right? I think some of those puritanical elements of America with the Calvinists maybe maintained temporarily, right? Some more conservative elements in terms of culture, but eventually we were always trailing Europe by about 20 years. And I think now, we've caught them, but even more so, it's more than caught them. We've surpassed them, right? Because it's America through Hollywood, the porn industry, contraception, pornography, all these things that America pushes out to the rest of the world. You know, we've surpassed them. And it was always going to be the case. That's what a liberal society is. And Italy has been affected by it, just like everybody has. The French have done a lot of damage. Don't get me wrong. The French are probably even more guilty than the Americans in regards to destroying European culture. They're so gone in France. And that's the irony of it all, right? Even at the end, when Mussolini was trying to make a final agreement with the French and the British in 1938, the Easter Accords, he was desperately trying to stay out of the war. Well, there was a problem. The 1936 elections in France, the French elected a bunch of communists, Marxists, which made things even more contentious between the Catholic nation and a communist nation, two ideologies that are always at odds with one another. This is why I say again, the church has condemned communism. It's condemned Marxism. It's condemned liberalism. It never did condemn fascism. And non abbiamo bisogno was not a condemnation of fascism. I explained that in another cast. So this is what you have. You know, for me, I look at this part of the world with great fondness. I haven't been back here since 1986, and I think I said this earlier. My brother has gone a few times. My brother's 13 years younger, but he's healthy. He can travel, and I'm happy for him. I'm happy that he gets to experience that. For me, I'd like to go back, but I've health challenges that are really, really difficult for me at this point. Maybe we'll see one day. I don't know. Last time I was there was 86, had a great time. I'll never forget it. I have still vivid images of it. And, you know, but anyways, that's it, man. That's kind of history of my family, what was going on in 1943. Not a whole lot of details there, but there's stories that were passed on. I'm sure if I go back to Boston and talk to my dad's side of family, there's more stories. My mom's side, I think it's a little different. Like I said, most of them were born after the war, or if they were born before the war, they were very, very young. They can maybe transcribe what they heard about the war, that era, right, from my grandparents. But my dad's side, they're all gone now, right? All my aunts and uncles on my dad's side. But they were the ones that probably passed on some of the stories. And that's where I got the story of the Germans and the potato peels from, like I said earlier. And let's go back. Let's see if my cousins have any more stories. I'll share them with you guys. So there you go. Sicily, 1943, the invasion from the Allies. Let me pull up this full screen here, guys. Well, actually, let me stop sharing it. All right. So that's a little personal testimony about my family, where I come from. So you guys kind of get a gist of, who I am and what my experiences are, what my credentials are to speak on these matters, right? All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me. This is Frank. Sign off, Frank speaking. Good night, everybody.